well, she's wrong, she doesn't understand the law. A person being in the country illegally is a crime. It's a misdemeanor, and very often what we find is that there are other crimes attached to those individuals. So we don't believe that she's telling the truth. And this goes back to my comment earlier, is we see a lot of sensationalism in the media from some of our elected officials, and what they're saying is oftentimes not true. What we saw last weekend with Representative Grijalva, we believe that she did not tell the truth. Because there was a multi-year operation with some very dangerous individuals committing fraudulent crimes, violent crimes that were caught in that particular operation. And so what we're hearing from these representatives is not true. We're here to stand on the other side and tell you exactly what's going on and to actually get to the truth. Yes?
Isn't the use of the word belief there kind of cause concern on its own? Shouldn't we know for sure that people in these detention centers, if...
Listen to what you just heard, and feel the cold machinery of authoritarianism grinding into motion, because this is not some abstract academic question about federal jurisdiction or the technical definition of criminality under 8 U.S. Code Section 113.5. This is the sound of the state apparatus justifying its violence against human beings by deploying the oldest rhetorical trick in the fascist playbook, the redefinition of existence itself as criminal, the criminalization of presence, the transformation of a mother making tacos in Tucson into a national security threat. And I need you to understand right now, before we go any further, Representative Adelita Grijalva was pepper-sprayed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents during a Friday demonstration against an ICE raid at a Taco Giro restaurant on Tucson's west side, and the DHS immediately responded not with accountability, but with what amounts to gaslighting on an institutional scale, claiming in a statement that if her claims were true it would be a medical marvel, that they're not true, and that she wasn't pepper-sprayed, even though video posted online shows an agent in green fatigues indiscriminately dousing a line of several people including Grijalva with pepper spray, and this blatant denial of documented reality should tell you everything you need to know about what we're witnessing in America right now. The county attorney in this clip stands there with the confidence of a man who knows the system will protect him as he deploys what Orwell would recognize as doublespeak in its purest form, claiming that being in the country illegally is a misdemeanor crime, therefore justifying a military-style crackdown that involved ICE executing 16 search warrants across southern Arizona, alongside the IRS related to immigration and tax violation. But here's what they're not telling you, because an ICE spokesperson said 46 people were arrested across southern Arizona during the operation Friday, all undocumented Mexican nationals arrested for civil immigration offenses, and none of those arrested have any other charges at this time, which completely obliterates the narrative that this was about dangerous criminals and violent offenders, and you need to sit with that for a moment, because what we're seeing is the Trump administration conducting operations that result in the vast majority of arrests being people with no prior criminal record, with more than 80% of immigrants arrested in D.C. during the surge in federal law enforcement this year, having no prior criminal record even though that crackdown was portrayed as targeting violent crime, and this pattern repeats across the country from Tucson to Washington to Chicago to New Orleans. Let me take you inside the actual mechanics of what happened at that Taco Giro, because the details matter enormously when we're talking about state violence, and Representative Grijalva arrived at a Taco Giro restaurant, which she described as a small mom-and-pop restaurant that has served the community for years, and when she presented herself as a member of Congress asking for more information, she was pushed aside and pepper-sprayed. And think about what that means in a functioning democracy, that a sitting member of Congress attempting to exercise constitutional oversight was met with chemical weapons deployed by masked federal agents. Video from journalists on the ground shows dozens of heavily armed agents, members of ICE's high-powered Homeland Security Investigations Wing, and the Department of Homeland Security's SWAT-style special response teams, deploying flashbang grenades, tear gas, and pepperball rounds at a taco restaurant in a residential neighborhood next to a church and a preschool. And if that doesn't crystallize for you the absolute authoritarian trajectory we're on, then I don't know what will. Now the county attorney invokes this notion that illegal presence is a crime, therefore everything that follows is justified. But this reveals such a profound either misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of how immigration law actually functions that it borders on malpractice, because civil violations are not crimes in the criminal law sense. They don't carry criminal penalties, they're handled through administrative proceedings in immigration court, and the conflation of civil immigration violations with criminal conduct is precisely the discursive move that fascism requires to transform entire populations into enemies of the state. It's how you get from a person overstaying a visa to militarized raids with armored vehicles and tactical teams. It's how you normalize state violence against the most vulnerable, And let me be absolutely clear about what's happening, because ICE arrests have soared since the start of Trump's second term, with ICE's main unit arresting roughly 1,100 people per day in recent weeks, well short of the administration's goal of 3,000 a day, with the daily arrest average between January 20th and October 15th being 821, which means we're watching the construction of a deportation machine operating at industrial scale. The clip mentions Representative Grijalva specifically, and accuses her of not telling the truth about a multi-year operation involving dangerous individuals and fraudulent crimes and violent crimes. But when you actually examine what happened, the entire narrative collapses under scrutiny, because what we're seeing is not targeted enforcement against cartel members or violent criminals. We're seeing a federal law enforcement officer acknowledging that ICE is taking anybody and everybody, rather than targeting dangerous individuals, and this is during operations at Home Depot parking lots targeting day laborers looking for work, people whose only crime is economic desperation under capitalism, and one farm worker named Jaime Elenis Garcia became the first known person to die as a result of the Trump administration's immigration enforcement operations after Garcia fell 30 feet from a building during a raid, sparking condemnation from United Farm Workers President Teresa Romero, while George Rites, a U.S. citizen and disabled veteran working as a security guard, was arrested when ICE agents broke his car window, pepper-sprayed him, threw him on the ground and detained him, which should horrify anyone with even a minimal commitment to human rights. What's particularly insidious about the rhetoric in this clip is the deployment of the phrase "we believe she did not tell the truth," which is itself a fascinating linguistic construction, because notice the county attorney doesn't say she lied, he doesn't say they have evidence contradicting her account, he says we believe she didn't tell the truth, which gives them plausible deniability while still poisoning the well. It's a propaganda technique straight out of authoritarian statecraft. You cast doubt on the credibility of anyone who challenges the official narrative. You make truth itself contingent and subjective, and this is happening at the exact moment when officials build enforcement efforts as targeting the worst of the worst criminal aliens. But the numbers tell a different story, with more than 370 people arrested, and only 44 of whom had any prior criminal record according to DHS. Which means the vast majority of people swept up in these raids are exactly who Representative Grijalva says they are: community members who've lived here for years or decades, parents and workers and neighbors whose only violation is existing without the proper paperwork, in a system designed to make that paperwork nearly impossible to obtain. And we need to talk about what this reveals about the carceral state and racial capitalism, because these raids aren't happening in wealthy white neighborhoods, they're happening at taco restaurants in Latino neighborhoods in Tucson, they're happening at Home Depot parking lots where immigrants wait for construction work, they're happening in ways that are specifically designed to terrorize entire communities. Federal immigration enforcement actions in Arizona have ramped up since Trump took office, with an increase of more than 1,200 immigration-related arrests in the first 6 months of 2025 compared to last year, and the resulting massive increase in immigration enforcement activity has been marked by a corollary increase in racial profiling, with ICE agents during raids across Los Angeles repeatedly targeting Latino neighborhoods until after a federal district court blocked agents from relying on race, ethnicity, occupation, or the use of Spanish or accented English. ICE arrests plunged by 66% before the Supreme Court greenlit the use of those factors, which is an absolutely chilling acknowledgement that the enforcement regime is fundamentally about racial control. The county attorney talks about sensationalism in the media and elected officials not telling the truth, but the real sensationalism is the Trump administration's performative cruelty. It's the fact that no administration has ever used Border Patrol in this way, deploying them on this scale in U.S. cities and communities, with more than 2,000 agents right now in 25 cities. They're turning immigration enforcement into a traveling roadshow of state violence designed as much to intimidate as to actually remove people. What we saw in Charlotte were reports of school children remaining home and churches empty, and stores empty, creating a broad chilling effect. And that is partly what they're going for, because the administration is leaning heavily into the idea that if it's tough enough, and if it can intimidate enough people, that they will self-deport, which is a strategy of collective punishment that would be recognized as such under international humanitarian law, if we were talking about occupied territory abroad. Representative Grijalva herself has provided absolutely devastating testimony about what she witnessed, because she described seeing maybe 40 ICE agents, most of them masked, in several vehicles that the community had stopped, and said the biggest problem is that Trump has no regard for any due process, the rule of law, the Constitution, and that they're literally disappearing people from the streets, and that language of disappearance should send a shiver down your spine, because it invokes the Latin American dictatorships of the 70s and 80s, the desaparecidos of Argentina and Chile, and while the scale is different, the mechanism is similar: the use of unaccountable state violence to terrorize populations deemed expendable. And when you have a member of Congress accusing the Trump administration of denying due process for those arrested while literally disappearing people from the streets and saying ICE agents arrested 2 people, and we have no idea where they're going, that's not sensationalism, that's congressional oversight confronting the machinery of deportation. The clip's focus on whether crimes are attached to individuals misses the entire point, because the administration has explicitly abandoned any pretense of prioritizing enforcement based on public safety threat. Under the Biden administration, people who hadn't committed another crime weren't prioritized for arrest and deportation, but now agents have a broader mandate and have been encouraged to make more collateral arrests, apprehending undocumented people who happen to be with someone on a target list, such as people in the same household. And while the Trump administration highlights the worst of the worst amongst its arrests, the majority of people arrested don't have another criminal violation, which means the system is explicitly designed to cast the widest possible net, to separate families, to create terror. And this is not a bug, it's the feature, because the cruelty is the point. The cruelty sends the message. And let's talk about what happened when Grijalva tried to exercise her constitutional authority, because this matters enormously for understanding the authoritarian turn. She's a freshman member of Congress, sworn in last month, more than 7 weeks after winning a special election for the seat of her late father, Representative Raul Grijalva, who died earlier this year, representing a border region that extends from Tucson to Yuma. And she became the 218th signatory on the bipartisan Epstein Files Transparency Act, which compels the Justice Department, FBI, and federal prosecutors to disclose documents by December 19th. So she's already demonstrated courage in challenging power, and when she shows up to a raid in her own district and identifies herself and attempts to get information about what's happening to her constituents, federal agents respond with violence, and the DHS spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin then claims that 2 law enforcement officers were seriously injured by this mob that Grijalva joined, and that presenting oneself as a member of Congress doesn't give you the right to obstruct law enforcement, which is an absolutely Orwellian reframing of congressional oversight as obstruction. What you're hearing in this clip is the sound of local law enforcement officials fully captured by the Trump administration's authoritarian project, repeating talking points about media sensationalism and elected officials lying while providing cover for a deportation apparatus that is by design operating outside normal legal constraints. And we know this because the transparency has been pretty limited, frankly, and under the Trump administration that has always been an issue. It has long been an issue in immigration enforcement to understand exactly who's being targeted, where they're being taken, and why, but it seems here everything is blurring together: the people taken off the streets, where they're actually going, who they are, how to find them, and it seems to be getting increasingly harder by the day, based on talking to family members and attorneys for families literally searching for their loved ones, which describes a system of detention and removal that deliberately obscures accountability. The county attorney talks about standing on the other side to tell the truth, but the actual truth is that the Department of Homeland Security announced that 2 million people identified as illegal aliens have been removed or self-deported since January 20th, with the Trump administration on pace to deport nearly 600,000 in the first year, including an estimated 1.6 million who voluntarily self-deported and more than 400,000 deportations. And those self-deportation numbers tell you everything about the climate of fear that's been constructed. People are fleeing not because they've been ordered removed through due process, but because the state has made existence itself untenable. And meanwhile, Secretary Noem negotiates new detention facilities including Alligator Alcatraz, Speedway Slammer, Cornhusker Clink, and Louisiana Lockup, and DHS has signed more than 1,287 agreements across 40 states, which represents the massive expansion of local federal cooperation in immigration enforcement that immigrant rights advocates have warned against for decades. The resistance to these raids is growing, and it's significant because the resistance unfolding in places like Boone and Harlan is not noise, but a signal suggesting that America's political fault lines are shifting beneath our feet. The coming deportation raids were supposed to be a mop-up operation, executed in the heart of real America, far from sanctuary cities, but instead they are turning into a slog met with 1,000 cuts of small-town rebellions, hardly the passive or supportive response that hardliners in Washington might have expected. And as the enforcement regime trickles out into broader white America, it is encountering the same unruly spirit that has long defined its deepest hills, valleys, and backwoods. We're seeing clergy getting pepper sprayed at protests, We're seeing local business leaders speaking out. We're seeing mayors trying to limit cooperation even as mayors and local officials are making life harder for federal law enforcement while being careful not to go over the line because the law forbids local leaders from impeding or interfering with federal officers, but cities are finding ways to push back on unwanted immigration enforcement. What the county attorney in this clip won't tell you is that the operation at Taco Giro was part of a broader pattern of workplace raids targeting restaurants and small businesses that employ immigrant labor. It's economic warfare against communities of color disguised as law enforcement. The Taco Giro investigation, which IC said has been years in the making and carried out in partnership with the criminal investigative arm of the IRS, would have preceded the April IRS-DHS agreement on sharing individuals' taxpayer information, which means the government is now weaponizing tax records to facilitate deportations, creating yet another mechanism by which any interaction with the state becomes a potential pathway to detention and removal. And this has absolutely catastrophic implications for immigrant communities who now have to weigh whether filing taxes or accessing any government service puts them at risk. The violence at the Tucson raid was extensive and documented. Federal law enforcement officers pepper-sprayed Democratic Representative Adelita Grijalva, her staff and other community members protesting an immigration raid at a taco restaurant on Tucson's west side in a historic Latino neighborhood, with Arizona Luminaria photographing officers dispersing a cloud-like substance at the crowd. And the fact that this happened in broad daylight in a residential neighborhood with journalists present tells you that the administration believes it can operate with complete impunity, that there will be no accountability for using military tactics against civilians, and they're largely correct because institutions that should provide checks and balances have been systematically captured or intimidated into compliance. The clip ends with someone asking whether the use of the word believe should cause concern, whether we should know for sure about people in detention centers, and yes, that should cause enormous concern because what we're witnessing is the deliberate construction of legal black holes where people disappear into detention facilities and deportation without clear documentation or accountability, where the message of these operations and widely reported efforts to use government data such as tax returns and social security records for immigration enforcement sends a message that all immigrants are receiving regardless of legal status, that any information given to the government can be used against them, and any interaction with the government could turn into an arrest, while immigrants who have no federal records are now at risk of being prosecuted as federal criminals for the crime of failing to register their existence with the government, which creates an impossible catch-22, where existence requires either exposure to deportation or criminal prosecution. This isn't about law and order. This is about constructing a permanent underclass of exploitable labor living in constant fear. This is about the reassertion of white supremacy through state violence. This is about capitalism requiring a population that can be terrorized into accepting any working conditions, any wages, any treatment, because the alternative is detention and deportation, and family separation. And when the county attorney stands there and accuses Democratic representatives of sensationalism and lying, what he's really doing is providing ideological cover for a deportation regime that is by any reasonable measure operating outside the bounds of democratic accountability and human rights norms, and we cannot allow that narrative to stand unchallenged because the stakes are quite literally life and death for millions of people living in this country who deserve dignity and due process, and the basic recognition of their humanity regardless of their immigration status. And if we lose that, if we allow the state to criminalize existence itself and deploy military force against communities making tacos and picking vegetables and building houses, then we've lost something fundamental about what it means to live in a society governed by law rather than by violence. And that loss will come for all of us eventually because authoritarianism never stops with its first targets. It always expands, it always finds new enemies, and the machinery of oppression once constructed will be turned against anyone who challenges power, which means this moment right now requires us to stand in solidarity with immigrant communities under attack, not despite our commitment to justice, but precisely because of it, because the struggle against the deportation machine is inseparable from every other struggle against state violence and racial capitalism and the carceral system, and Representative Grijalva getting pepper-sprayed while trying to exercise congressional oversight is not a bug in the system. It's a message about what happens when you stand in the way of the machine, and we need to hear that message clearly and respond not with fear, but with collective resistance and mutual aid, and an absolute refusal to accept the normalization of state terror, dressed up in the language of law enforcement.